today's gospel is one of the most popular, probably most well-known of Jesus' miracles. In fact, we find it in all four of the gospels, the feeding of the 5,000. And it's always a danger, like the times when we hear these types of gospels that are very, very familiar to us, to say, well, I know the story already. And even, of course, as preachers at times, it can be the same thing. Well, what do I preach about this time when I'm reflecting on this reading? And of course, as I usually do, I take a look at some other commentaries, some other homilies to get some ideas. And I always, take bits and pieces to help put them together to help make my own homily. Well, I have to admit, this time I took a little bit even more. In fact, the whole theme of my homily is one that I just chose to borrow from an earlier homily, because not that I preached, but one that comes back from around 2004 by Redemptorist priest James A. Wallace. Because it was one of those situations where I read it and I said, this is so perfect, this schema is so perfect. So I take the basic structure of it from him, although I certainly do include many of my own points. But I felt his take on it was so appropriate, so perfect for our situation, even though it was written about 15 years ago. We see Jesus withdraw at the beginning of the gospel today, after he hears the news that St. John the Baptist has in fact been killed, been beheaded. Now, while the gospel isn't explicit about why Jesus does that, it just says he goes off by himself, and there have been different theories presented by the church fathers and by different commentaries. As Father Wallace spoke about in his homily, I do think Jesus is certainly feeling some fear at this point. How could he not, if knowing that he himself will have to go through great suffering, great passion, he hears what happens with John the Baptist, he knows that he too will have to undergo a great suffering. And so again, Jesus being fully human is someone who is subject to fear. We know both fully human and fully divine. And sometimes we put too much emphasis on one or the other, and sometimes we think, well, Jesus, maybe he wasn't afraid. But of course, we know he certainly was afraid in the Garden of Gethsemane. We know he said, my soul is sorrowful even unto death. And so he takes on human fear. As one commentary put it, as a man, he has a natural aversion to suffering, both physically, in terms of crucifixion, but also spiritually, in terms of bearing the weight of all the sins of the world. So as God's Son, he could have suppressed these human passions, but he chose to accept them as part of God's plan, as part of what it meant to take on humanity, to take on flesh. And so it's a very, again, incarnational aspect of Jesus. So he takes on that fear. So what are the types of fears? Of course, we know Jesus was afraid of the suffering that he would have to undergo in these two different ways, both physical and spiritual. We know that we too have much physically and spiritually to fear. At the time Father Wallace was writing his homily, he was speaking about things like, the aftermath of September 11th, the fear of terrorism. There was the issues with anthrax being mailed to people. There was issues with, mass shootings and different things that were taking place, causing fear at that time. Of course, we have our own fears along with the COVID virus and the continuing restrictions that it places on things, that uncertainty that comes from all that, the economic fears, those who have lost their jobs or afraid of losing their jobs or having reduced hours, those who, the damage in relationships, so insidious this disease because it even puts into question, spending time with people and how should I do it and who should I do it with and, what ways and what precautions, and it becomes very confusing. It's difficult, makes for difficult decisions to make, to understand what to do. So all of these are, of course, are causes of our fear, not understanding what is happening next and what will happen next. And so we start with fear, but as we see Jesus, then the people find him and come to him. And it says he had pity on them. He begins to heal them, to teach them, and ultimately, as we know, to feed them in the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. So we see what happens when we move from faith to fear. And so Father Wallace, the basic outline that he provides that I'm following today is that he speaks about going from fear to faith to feeding. From fear to faith to feeding. And that's what we see in the gospel, and that's what we see that the Lord is calling us to in our own lives as well. So fear, again, is a human emotion. It's very natural, not a sin in of itself. But again, it does depend on how we react to fear. If we let fear overtake us, then in a way that we don't serve others, we aren't attentive to the needs of others, that's where it can become sinful. It's why we need the virtue then of courage, of fortitude, to be able to recognize the ways God is calling us to step out of ourselves, to call us to serve one another. Again, my mind goes to the Holy Family as we reflect on, of course, St. Joseph as our parish patron. Think of the fact that Jesus, Mary and Joseph, had to flee into Egypt, that there was nowhere for Jesus to be born, the fact that Jesus was lost. We know Mary and Joseph were very fearful, having lost Jesus when he was 12 years old, until they eventually found him in the temple a few days later. So we see even among the holiest family there is fear, there is anxiety, there is problems that develop. So fear doesn't mean the fact that we have lost all of our faith. It just simply means it's part of our human lives. It's part of our world that we live in, this fallen world that we're part of. And so we're called to reflect on moving, though, from fear to faith, to recognize that we have to keep moving. When Jesus was lost in the temple, of course, they didn't know, his parents, Mary and Joseph, did not know he was lost in the temple, but they kept moving to try and find him, right? Even though they were afraid, they didn't just stop and give up. Of course, they kept looking for him. And that's the same thing that we have to do. Just as Jesus was there to be there for the people in need, we have to look to others. The first thing that we do in the state of fear is to say, okay, I need to stop looking at myself and seeing what I'm called to do, what I'm called to serve, to be with others, to serve others in this time. And even though it's such a cliche, it's true that it's a call to take one day at a time, to take one thing at a time. I was recently came across some things of a mother who was reflecting on dealing with a daughter who was born with a cleft lip and a palate. There was an issue that, the doctors knew that this was something that she would need many surgeries over many years. And they started to tell her about and said, well, okay, here's what probably these next 18 years are going to look like. And she just kind of said, stop, wait a minute. I don't feel the need to know about everything that's going to happen in the next 18 years. Just tell me what we need to do now and what we need to do, in preparation for the next thing. I don't want to hear about all 18 years. I just want to reflect on what's happening right now. And so that's such an important reflection. Another wife and mother reflecting similarly, saying, do I have what I need for today? Do I have what I can do to live out today? And here's the powerful thing about our gospel today. Even when we don't feel like we have what we need for today, if we give it to the Lord, he gives us what we need for today, right? The apostles have just those few loaves, those few fish, and so they didn't feel like they had what they needed to feed the multitude. But of course, in giving it to Christ, he provides. He provides in a way that they would never have expected. It's the same thing for us. We're called to give everything over to the Lord and let him provide, let him multiply. God makes it work somehow when we put our trust in him and we stop focusing on our own inabilities or our own lack that we have. Again, we see this with Mary and Joseph. I think about the fact that Jesus wasn't born really in a suitable place, right? It's not really a suitable place to give birth in the stable with the animals. And yet it worked. Somehow it happened, right? Mary gave birth, Jesus was born. It all worked out, even though it wasn't the way that Mary or Joseph or any parents would want it to happen, yet somehow it worked out. And again, that mother speaking about the issue with the cleft palate. Later on, now this was years earlier, so she's talking about her daughter who now is, I believe, around 12 years old. There was this, okay, is she going to need another surgery in about a year from now? And there was a question, maybe she'll need it, maybe she won't. So, of course, the mother's praying that she won't need the surgery. But when they come, well, the doctor says, well, there's good news and bad news. The bad news is she is going to need the surgery. The good news is I've invented a new technique that's going to make it much less painful, that's going to make it much less damaging. It's going to be a simpler procedure than it was even just a year ago. So she saw God's answer to her prayers in that, not exactly what she asked for. She didn't want the daughter, of course, to have the surgery at all. And yet here she was going to have it, but it would be not quite as intensive not quite as difficult as it would have been even a year earlier. So we see this moving from fear to faith and to feeding. And of course, the feeding that Jesus provides, not only the food, the physical food that he provides for the people there, but of course, this is ultimately a sign of the Eucharist. All those signs that are in the gospel, Jesus takes, he breaks the bread, he distributes the bread after he blesses the bread, all those aspects we see in the Last Supper. And what does he do? He passes it to the apostles, right? The first priests. They're the ones who distribute it to the people. So we have those very clear Eucharistic themes as part of the gospel today. So Jesus feeds and nourishes his people. Same thing with us in the Holy Eucharist. Christ feeds and nourishes us. And again, it's very incarnational, even if it's not the way we would expect. Again, it doesn't look like a great feast, the Eucharist, but it always is. It's always fulfilling. It always gives us what we truly need. It doesn't look like a big Thanksgiving dinner with all the trimmings, but it's the food that we need, ultimately spiritually, is the food that truly fills us and transforms us. We hear about St. Paul, of course, who summarizes the reason not to ultimately give in to fear in our second reading today, right? What can separate us from the love of Christ? Nothing external can separate us from the love of Christ. So again, no matter what happens, and there are tragedies, there's things that are very challenging to deal with, or things that we can't really do anything about, like the death of a loved one, that things that are going to affect us deeply. And yet again, it's about Jesus not giving up on us, and us not giving up on Jesus, not giving up as long as we put our trust in the Lord, to recognize that this world is not all there is, that he's preparing us and feeding us, of course, for a world that's much better. We call the Eucharist the medicine of immortality. It's really the precursor to the gift. It's the highest form of worship we can offer. It's meant to be a precursor to the heavenly banquet, that image of being gathered around with all of God's people in the heavenly kingdom. So this is the ultimate good news, that no matter what happens in our lives, of course, Christ is with us, and nothing external can separate us from the love of Christ. As long as we don't give up on the Lord, as long as we keep trusting in Jesus, as long as we take the little bit that we have and we give it over to Christ to allow him to bless it and transform it and expand it in ways we never could. So I'm indebted to Father Wallace, the Redemptorist priest, who offered this homily back some 15 years ago. And he tells us that the gospel shows us how Jesus, and now we too, can move from fear to faith, now to feeding. And so we prepare to celebrate the great gift of the Mass, again, which is this movement of fear to faith to feeding. We bring our fears, we offer them on the altar every time we gather. We bring our stresses and anxieties, we give them over to Christ. They enter into the sacrifice of the Mass that's lifted up by the priest when he blesses the bread and the wine to transform it into the body and blood of Christ. And so it's lifted up on the cross with Christ as that great sacrifice of the Mass as we enter into those elements of the Lord's saving work. So the good news is that the Lord is with us to bring us from fear to faith to feeding, and that nothing can separate us from the love of Christ. This is the good news that we celebrate today and each time we gather for Holy Mass.